It's been interesting to see what folks have had to say about the late Paul Ehrlich after his March 13th passing.
Some of it surprised me, even though it shouldn't have.
We'll offer our take on the critiques and the praise.
And we'll share a very frank conversation we had with Paul in 2020 next.
When you lose a scientist with a megaphone and a backbone, who you gonna call?
Calling, 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 calling. Call a growth buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
You lucky dog, you've stumbled onto the Growth Busters podcast, where we expose and reject dead planet thinking.
If you've been thinking we can't go on growing our economy and population forever,
or if you've been wondering, where the hell is that pot of gold that's supposed to be at the end of the growth rainbow?
or if you know the answers to those questions and just want to hang out with fellow planet savers,
you're in the right place. I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth, and founder and chief scientist at the Institute to Squash Nonsense That Ignores Limits to Growth.
And I'm Stephanie Gardner, Growthbusters board member, environmental law and policy buff, and sustainable energy enthusiast.
Growthbusters is a nonprofit, which means we can't shine the spotlight on growth worship mythology and enlighten journalists, politicians, and educators without your financial support.
So if by some wild stroke of luck we say something that impresses you, please leave us a tip by clicking on Donate at the top of the page at growthbusters.org. We're continuing our tribute to the late Paul Ehrlich. In our last episode, we heard Dave's 2007 interview with Paul for the Growthbusters film. In a few minutes, we'll share a 2020 conversation with Paul from an episode observing the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Very appropriate since Earth Day is coming up.
Yeah, and I'm glad you could join me for this episode, Stephanie. As you know, I did part one of the Paul Ehrlich tribute without you in order to get it out quickly. But listen, before we do this, I want to share just a quick bit of news about Earth Day. And that is the first annual Growthbusters Earth Day Film Festival is coming up.
Oh, that sounds interesting. How does that work?
I decided that, there's just so many great both short films and feature-length films that communicate in an entertaining fashion what people really need to know about limits to growth. And, for years, we've shared the Growthbusters film on Black Friday every year. We used to make it free on Black Friday. Now it's just free year-round on YouTube. It's easy to find. Just head over to growthbustersmovie.org. But anyway, so I wanted to do something special and share some of these other films. So I took a look around and found many of them are available free on YouTube. So very easy to put together a playlist over there. The hard part is just kind of narrowing the list down so that you can actually see them all in, let's say, one weekend of Earth Day frenzy.
That sounds like a binge-worthy watch.
Yeah, instead of binging on The Madison or Squid Game or even The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, how about binging on something really meaningful and important for the future of your kids?
I love this concept. So what are some of the films that you've curated?
Well, we're definitely going to put the documentary Growthbusters, Hooked on Growth in there for anyone who hasn't had a chance to see it. And then one of my all-time favorite documentaries, No Impact Man. You remember that one?
I do remember that one. That's a good one.
It is. It's a great film. It's a lot of fun, a lot of charm, and good story. And then the documentary that really did stir up quite a controversial storm when it came out, Planet of the Humans, which was executive produced by Michael Moore. Another one called 8 Billion Angels, produced by Terry Spar, which is an excellent film about human overpopulation. Those are kind of at the top of the list. And then some of the great shorts, ours, Spaceship Earth Passenger Safety Briefing, which was selected to screen in the Wild and Scenic Film Festival. That's a nice 3-minute film. And I don't know if you remember seeing The Impossible Hamster.
I don't recall that one.
Not one of ours, but it's a great one about economics. Weird Al Yankovic's First World Problems is one of my favorites, so I'll probably slot that in there. And then another one of the shorts that I produced quite a while ago now called Avoid Unplanned Parenthood. So probably those will be in there, but I'm still open to suggestions. So if you hear this podcast and you have some nominations for films that we ought to include in the first annual Growthbusters Earth Day Film Festival, shoot us a note.
Well, this already sounds like a great lineup. I can't wait to see some of the ones that I haven't seen yet. And this goes live on April 16th. Is that right?
That's right, because Earth Day is on April 22nd, and that's in the middle of the week. Most Earth Day activities this year are scheduled the weekend before. So I figure if we get this live on April 16th, that will allow you to binge over the weekend when Earth Day is in full bloom. And we're not going to turn it off, so you can watch anytime you want.
And where can folks find this?
It should be obvious by now that it's virtual. You don't have to go anywhere, so you can stream them. You just have to head over to earthdayfilmfestival.com.
Super, and I'm sure we'll put that in the show notes.
And as I said, there'll be a playlist on YouTube as well, so it'll be pretty easy to find. Now, before we hear Paul Ehrlich's Earth Day conversation, I want to give you, Stephanie, a chance to just say a few words about Paul and his passing, since I got to do that in the last episode.
Yeah. I was obviously really saddened to hear about that, but I know he was in his early 90s, so he had a very long, good life. I was fortunate enough to interview Paul on an episode of the Growth Busters podcast, which was, I was looking back at that, published June 1st in 2022. And that episode was called Paul Ehrlich on the Limits to Growth. And at the time, I felt like I was meeting a celebrity, having learned about Paul's work in my environmental studies coursework during college, and then seeing him on the big screen in your documentary, of course. And he was just a fabulous thinker and so articulate on a variety of topics. He's truly a legend and has left us a great legacy. So I hope that our listeners enjoy rehearing some of the conversations that the Growth Busters podcast has had with him over the years. They're definitely worth going back and listening to, and frankly, still just as relevant today, if not even more relevant, given the current state of affairs.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that for sure. He was pretty darn charming and good to you as well. And in fact, I've pulled a couple of little clips from that episode to share toward the end of this podcast. Right now, our plan isn't to reprise that episode and continue the Paul Ehrlich tribute beyond this episode, but who knows, we might change our mind. We'll put a link in the show notes, and it's easy to find on your podcast app. A couple of quick things I want to share. One is there was this neat moment. I wish I had recorded it, but I'll never, ever forget the morning after I emailed Paul Ehrlich a link to see a preview of the Growth Busters documentary. The very next morning, he emailed me early and asked if we could Skype. And that's what we did back in that day, was Skype. There was no Zoom yet. Skype was how we actually had audio and video calls. And so we got on Skype that morning. It was still early. He was in his home office in his bathrobe. He was just so excited to talk to me about the film and congratulate me for it. That just meant a lot. He did ask me to produce a shorter version that would fit into a typical college class period. He wanted a 50-minute version, and the version I had sent him was 90 minutes at the time. So I spent the next several months working really hard trying to get that thing cut to 50. Never did manage to do that. We got it down to 55 minutes, and that is the length it stands today. And I also want to mention that Paul, his infamy sprang from that amazing book, The Population Bomb, that really got the world's attention back in 1968. And he got the full writing credit for it, but his wife, Anne, was his writing partner on that. And she wasn't listed on the book only because the publisher thought that it needed to just have one author's name on it in order to be promoted properly, I guess. In fact, throughout Paul's 50-plus year career, Anne was often his writing partner, and she was actually a research scientist at Stanford University as well.
Well, I'm glad you are giving Anne some credit as well here. It's important not to miss that.
I will put some links in the show notes to some recommended reading related to this subject, including my Substack column, Dave the Planet, that I published shortly after his passing, and also a link to Goodbye Paul Ehrlich, which was posted on the Overpopulation Project website, which is excellent. That post has many good points and good comments, and among them, Phil Cafaro posted a long piece written by Sandy Irvine I think he might have gotten that from Facebook. It's really thorough and has links to many good examples of Paul's work, so you do not want to miss that. Another commenter to that piece on the overpopulation project was a comment by Australian politician Kelvin Thomson. What he posted was, Paul was a towering figure who made an unparalleled contribution to the population debate. I hope his death received some attention in the U.S. It passed unnoticed and unremarked in Australia, which seems a far cry from the observation that in his earlier years he appeared on TV so often he had to join the Screen Actors Guild. I'd forgotten about that. And Philip Cafaro replied, a surprisingly small story here in the U.S. The obit in the New York Times was pathetic, hardly suited to one of our leading scientists for the past half-century and a founder of the modern environmental movement. And then lastly, I'll share a link to something that is not an obituary, but it was an excellent account of Ehrlich's life that was published back in 2009, The Vindication of a Public Scholar. 40 years after the population bomb ignited controversy, Paul Ehrlich continues to stir debate. Written by Tom Turner, we'll put a link in the show notes. In that, there was a quote from Peter Raven, who was a botanist who worked beside Paul Ehrlich at the Jasper Ridge Reserve in Colorado in summers. I regret that the population bomb has been parodied mercilessly by people who don't know what they're talking about. It was a wonderful wake-up call. Tom Turner also shared something. He asked Paul what he most hopes he's wrong about. He reported that Paul's answer was, I hope the future doesn't turn out to be as bleak as it looks from here. I want my grandchildren to have a good life. Detractors really came out of the woodwork in the days following Ehrlich's death. There was one Substack column, False Prophets of Doom, R.I.P. Paul Ehrlich and his decided lack of optimism. That column proclaimed, there were about 3.5 billion people on Earth in 1970. There are about 8.5 billion today. Yet none of Ehrlich's prognostications of doom have come true. Also in that column, more people have more caloric abundance and more cheap energy. The current oil and gas supply shock caused by the fighting in the Middle East notwithstanding. The world, in fact, throws away 30% of the calories it produces every single day. We do not extract nearly as much oil and gas as we could because demand is stable and alternative forms of energy are increasingly meeting our energy needs. The world is not, in other words, experiencing a resource crunch.
Well, that's unfortunate. Did you decide to chime in the comment section, Dad?
I was trying to resist because I really didn't want these things to be a time suck. But yes, I did post a comment. I posted, this piece lists quite a number of problems and yet chooses to discount them. This could have been titled, Yes, But. The Green Revolution, for example, produces a lot of food at what cost? Climate disruption, ocean dead zones, toxification, fertile soil depletion, and biodiversity loss. Ehrlich distrusted technology, and we would be wise not to bet our future on it. Per Severide's law, the chief cause of problems is solutions. This piece also states that we face population decline. Well, we're not experiencing it yet, but yes, population will contract, and we should be thankful for that. It would be nice if we do it voluntarily, ethically, peacefully, and elegantly. We have not proven that this planet can sustainably meet the needs, let alone the demands, of 6, 7, 8 billion or more people living decent lives. And Stephanie, I'll just report that brought on plenty of mean comments after that.
Well, I thought that what you wrote was very well said.
I do want to share one thoughtful comment that also brought on more mean and rude comments in response. Michael wrote, he was an amazingly optimistic person, a great teacher and mentor, and fearless in the face of critics who ignored the data. His writings with Anne Ehrlich also focused on speciation, and the data there are clear and frightening. And ignorance of how natural systems work does not mean that critics are right. The number of drought events, food shortages, famines has not declined. At his core, he was an optimist and a realist who looked at the best then available data and drew logical conclusions. I cannot remember a time when Paul was not optimistic about human potential, supportive and proud of his students, and permanently intellectually curious. Nor can I remember a time when he was not warm and smiling and finding things to laugh about, often himself. Food technology did improve, and overall production increased, but the benefits are disparate, and the underlying degradation of ecosystems and their services are real and present dangers. He goes on, I'll skip ahead a little bit. His passing is a loss, and perhaps we should look at his whole life and comment on that. A brave and caring soul who said what he felt needed to be said based on the available science and, frankly, who would have never written about the passing of a fellow member of our species with any form of celebration.
Well, that's a very nice comment from this Michael person. I wonder if they worked together. He sounds like he kind of knew Paul pretty well.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Well, thanks for sharing those, Dad. It sounds like there is a lot of both good and bad out there online in the wake of Paul's passing for our listeners to potentially go engage with if they're so inclined to learn a little bit more about Paul's body of work and maybe go defend him in the comments section.
Yeah, and stick with us. We're going to share now this reprise of the Earth Day conversation that we recorded in 2020. But following that, we're going to talk a little bit more about what some of the detractors have been saying. And I really do want to offer, I think, a valuable perspective about what's right and what's wrong and the critiques. When we recorded this in 2020, that was before you joined the podcast, Stephanie. I did have a co-host at that time. It was Erica Arias, so it's going to be fun to hear Erica's voice. Haven't heard that in a while. And I just want to mention that Paul was so candid in this conversation, we really considered doing some editing to clean him up. We had a conversation about that, Erica and I. But ultimately, we decided to share his words without censorship. And we, in fact, titled the episode, Paul Ehrlich, Uncensored on Earth Day 50th Anniversary. So here's Paul from episode 43 of the Growth Busters podcast. Paul, thanks so much for joining us today. It is a privilege and an honor to get an hour of your day.
It's my pleasure. I never imagined I'd be super busy when I'm almost 88 and retired, and thought that I would be just lying around reading good books, drinking good wine, chasing good women, doing the things that us retired folks ought to do.
Retired? I haven't seen any sign of that. But it's official, huh?
All I don't do that I used to do is meet classes. But of course now they aren't meeting classes. I get about 200 emails a day from Stanford University explaining all the procedures and so on. It turns out the university is going to partially shut down, but nobody would notice the difference because it still isn't doing anything at all to solve the problems you and I have been concerned about for all these years. The universities, and I say the same for Harvard, Yale, etc., are still behaving as if their structures created by Aristotle are still wonderful and not teaching. Good lesson today. Some of you may have heard there's a pandemic going on, and it's crystal clear that many of the educated people in our country do not understand what exponential growth is. It's a beautiful example of the failure of our educational system right up through graduate school.
It is a pretty graphic, real-life demonstration going on right there, isn't it? Your mention, Paul, of Stanford makes me want to jump ahead to a question that I was going to save for if we had time, and that I'm just going to jump onto it. You've retired recently from teaching at Stanford. You have been at Stanford forever, for pretty much your entire career.
Yeah, I came here in 59.
Yeah. You've been pretty outspoken. You're kind of a bad boy in a lot of ways. Stanford, I want to know, why did they keep you? This is the place where they have the Hoover Institution, and they have Paul Ehrlich.
Well, I can give you my own theory, but there's a large literature. Excuse me, I always need a little gin when I'm doing these things.
I was hoping for that.
The Stanford was pretty much of a finishing school early on. And in the 50s, a president named Wallace Sterling came in, and he had a very bright provost he appointed named Fred Terman, who was the son of the Stanford Binet IQ test Terman. And they decided to turn it into a really world-class university. And they knew that they couldn't at the time compete with places like Harvard, Yale, in terms of money. So what they decided to do was build some, what they called, I believe it was steeples or pinnacles of excellence. They would hire groups of really good people in certain areas and build the university's reputation around them. And it was in part in science and engineering. Terman was an engineer. That's where Silicon Valley came from.
Wow.
Now, I was outspoken. On the other hand, in those days, a fair number of rich people were concerned about the population problem. They were concerned because there was going to be too many people of the kind they don't like. It was a very racist thing. But bringing in the environment and so on was not really threatening to the establishment that runs our country, to the corporate bosses. And also, the last thing Terman or Wallace Sterling wanted was a fuss with a loudmouth young professor who they were trying to shut up, because you don't build steeples of excellence and hire excellent people if you have the reputation for not letting them say whatever they think. So I think they thought I was, if anything, possibly a little positive, but certainly trying to stamp on me was not a price that they wanted to pay, particularly since all my colleagues in the department were on my side. I mean, Don Kennedy, who later became the president of the university and was head of the Food and Drug Administration, last 10 years of his career, who was the editor of Science, really big deal. He read the population bomb for me and is acknowledged in it, as are a whole bunch of other important people. So I was pretty well armored against any flack, and in fact got none. I have to say, I've got my complaints about Stanford, as you just heard.
Yeah.
But Stanford has been an ideal place for me. They have never tried in any way. When I went on TV and called Richard Nixon a crook, I didn't get a peep out of the administration, particularly because most of the people in the administration thought he was a crook too.
And you know, you were on the Tonight Show probably more than any other professor in the country at the time.
I did something like 20 of them, but Carson, again, tells you about power relations in our society. Carson got the population, the book was sent to him by Arthur Godfrey, who was a very well-known celebrity at the time. He and I shared being pilots, and Carson was really interested in the issues. More importantly, he was arguably the most important personality in Hollywood. Ann and I had dinner with him and Joanna one night in one of the fancy Hollywood restaurants. Everybody who came in felt necessary to come over to John's table and make obeisance of some sort or another. And he was not he was a relatively shy guy, very nice guy, very, very, very smart. He was the easiest person to work with on all the time I did on TV, and I was a correspondent for NBC News and so on. John was a pleasure to work with always.
Yeah, and I hadn't realized that you had that stint as a correspondent. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sam Hurst and I, and a photographer named Keith Hathaway, did a series of bits over a 3-year period for the Today Show. And we did things on the cattle industry and so on and so forth. Made a lot of trouble, got, I think, an Emmy nomination for it. But we go in the field. I would tell Sam about what I thought we ought to do in science, and he is very, very smart, still involved in trying to show people what's happening to Native Americans and so on. And he would design a shoot. We would go, and I controlled the science. He controlled how we did it. And Keith Hathaway did brilliant photographic work. So the three of us traveled around the world, and we'd take months to do something that showed for 5 minutes on the Today Show. But it was very nice to see the inside of the workings of NBC.
Were there any challenges there with censorship?
Oh, the bigwigs weren't happy with what we did, but the same sort of thing. They wouldn't challenge Carson, and they wouldn't challenge the people that were doing the Today Show when it was a very popular show. But there was a lot of Mickey Mouse going on all the time. The battles between who was going to be the person running the show and so on. And Sam finally got so disgusted with NBC that he went into bison ranching. So that can show you what a talented person in TV finally gets fed up. The trivial battles and the nonsense and the attempts for control from above. But I didn't. Sam, who had been as a combat correspondent in Vietnam, did not take things lightly, and that's probably why we eventually got canceled. I'll tell you one quick story. We were filming in Arizona on the destruction of the western areas by overgrazing with cattle. People who go to a place like Arizona and New Mexico think it's normally barren like that, but of course originally the grass came up to the horses' bellies and more. So we snuck into a fenced-off area, and we're in an arroyo filming the place, which is covered with cow pats, and there wasn't a green blade of anything visible. And along comes a cowboy with 2 6-shooters on a horse, followed by a pit bull. And my instinct was to run, but Sam goes up and gives him a big smile. He says, "What are you fellas doing?" And Sam says, "We're photographing the wildflowers." And he says, "Oh, really?" And he looks around. There's not a blade of grass, not a flower, nothing. And Sam says, "Would you like to be in the shot?" And the guy says, "Yeah." He says, "You just ride off there into the sunset and we'll film you as you go." And the cowboy rode off into the sunset. I was really relieved.
Oh.
So we had good time on our shoots. And I don't see much of Sam anymore, but he was a great guy to work with. He wrote a book called The Man with a Rattlesnake Under His Hat about the snake exhibit in the reptile exhibit in South Dakota in the Black Hills. Great book. And I don't have any financial interest in it. I'm just boosting it.
Paul, I kind of want to just go back to the education system for a little bit, mainly just as someone who will be starting graduate school soon. It was really hard. It was really hard finding people who were interested in studying the relationship between population and the environment. And, you know, in my search, a lot of the articles that I was finding were coming out of just Australia or other parts of the world, but not here. Not very many people are talking about it. And when you bring it up, it's sort of unwelcome. But I guess as somebody who's wanting to study this topic, do you have any advice or?
Well, the universities themselves are not usually focused in the right way, but at all universities, like at Stanford, and certainly at Stanford, there are a whole bunch of people who understand the world and are desperately trying to fix something in it. But the whole structure of the university is designed to make that difficult or impossible. The departmental structure, which runs almost everything in most universities, is based on the ideas of an old friend of mine that you may have heard of, but probably didn't meet, a guy named Aristotle. He wrote books a while ago. You can't name a standard department in which you could study any of the major problems of humanity, because it will overlap the edges of the department. People say, well, what you need is interdisciplinary work between departments. But the money and the perks all flow down departmental lines. So when they establish interdisciplinary programs, they generally don't do much. Certainly characteristic of Stanford. We have brilliant environmental scientists here doing great stuff, but we have an interdisciplinary program which doesn't do anything. I mean, the people in it do things, but as a program, it doesn't do anything, and it doesn't do what needs to be done. That is, every incoming freshman, if they haven't had really good environmental education and mathematical education through their entire L-High system you can get all the way through Stanford and not have any idea what an ecosystem service is, what the second law of thermodynamics tells you about your life, how many people there are in the world, why the human population has grown so much, what the food situation is. None of those things, you can find out about them if you pick the right course and the right professor to work with, but you'd never get it just coming in at random, going through the standard curriculum in some department. And my advice to you is very simple. You want to go for a PhD program?
I got into the University of Oregon's PhD program, so I'll be working with Richard York, who is actually very supportive of this topic.
I know his work very well, and you've done the right thing. What I was going to recommend is make a connection with a faculty member before you choose the university, because the name of the university is nowhere near as important as who you are working with in it and what his reputation is. And so you've picked exactly the right thing. Mm-hmm. It's also a nice place to live, as opposed to, say, the Northeast, where I once lived, but fortunately fled.
Where did you go?
I was an undergraduate at Penn. Then I did my graduate work at the University of Kansas. Why at the University of Kansas? Because they had the best person working with insects, which is what I wanted to do, in the world at that time. He was a guy that I had met in the American Museum when I was 15, and we remained friends to a couple of years ago when he died at the age of, I think, 95 or 96. So I had that long a relationship with my major professor. It's like joining a family.
Yeah.
You can divorce a dozen husbands, but you'll never get rid of your major professor. Just remember that. He'll be a factor in your life forever. People will be asking him about job recommendations and so on for you forever.
So, Paul, you mentioned your interest in insects. Were you chasing butterflies as a kid? You were kind of a scientific prodigy, weren't you?
I don't know if I was a prodigy. I got very interested. I was interested in nature, mostly from being in summer camps. My parents sent me to summer camps, in a YMCA camp originally in central Pennsylvania. And I liked the nature stuff. And then I got introduced to butterflies and butterfly collecting. And that hooked me. The combination of aesthetics and scientific interest and being able to study the different patterns on their wings. As somebody once wrote, and I can't remember the quote exactly anymore, but it's sort of like the entire evolutionary history of butterflies is written in the patterns on their wings. Mm-hmm. And you can see those patterns very easily, and they turn out to be the most important organisms for studying evolution in nature, because unlike fruit flies, which I've worked with and can be very useful, you don't know in nature when you see a fruit fly what fruit fly it is. But with butterflies, you not only know what butterfly it is, what species it is, but you can write a number on its wings and follow it around. I've probably written more numbers on butterfly wings than I've drunk glasses of wine, which is an incredible number of butterflies marked.
Wow, butterfly graffiti.
Yeah, right.
I don't know too much about butterflies. I think I know more about moths and evolutionary reasons for why they change color.
Oh, the pepper moth story.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a standard story. You see, you don't really have to say, I don't know butterflies, I just know moths. Butterflies are just day-flying moths. They're a group of moths that manage to get into the daytime niche primarily by becoming poisonous. They're distasteful, and so they're more readily protected from being eaten than the average moth is. Oh. If you're into moths, you're into butterflies automatically. They're just moths.
And more beautiful.
Listen, there are some gorgeous moths. Unlike butterflies, I have watched maybe 5,000 moths on a sheet in New Guinea with a black light, and seen maybe there are 400 or 500 species there with incredible patterns, incredible different poses when they land. Hawk moths are gorgeous and fascinating. No, I could get into moths if I started all over again, but butterflies have the advantage for me of great amateur interest.
Yeah.
In fact, the single best paper I was ever involved in science was based on citizen science. That is, on the huge number of people who collect and study butterflies, because they all want perfect specimens for their collections. And the way you get perfect specimens that haven't been flying around and had scales knocked off their wings and so on is by finding the caterpillars, raising them, watching the pupa, the resting stage where the caterpillar turns into the butterfly, and then when it comes out, wait till its wings are dry and then kill it and put it in your collection. But in order to do that, you have to know what plant the caterpillar is going to eat. And when you find that out, you publish a little note in an entomology journal. And as a result of the amateur effort, we know more about the diets of butterflies than of any other large group of organisms of any kind. In other words, the work that Peter Raven and I did on coevolution was based on the efforts of amateurs.
Knowing what's happening to the insect population out there, I'm feeling guilty about having chased down butterflies with a net when I was a kid. And what you just described sounds terribly brutal today.
You say you feel a little guilty about the insects?
Well, do you? I mean, it's probably hard to study them without, a lot of things that you study you don't have to kill.
For most of my studies, I didn't kill. For most insects, you're not likely to damage their populations severely, even by killing some of them. They're short-lived as adults, and they can build huge populations easily. But of course, for instance, the populations I studied most intensively for half a century or so on Stanford's campus, we would occasionally take an individual, but 99% of the ones handled were given a mark and released. And that's virtually what I did. But I had no compunction about making collections when I did and where I did, particularly compared to spraying the world with pesticides and disrupting habitats and plowing things down. In most cases, the activities of collectors are not important, but they can be, depending again on the population and so on. I think it's a nice trend started not by me. I can't remember the names of the people who did it, but is moving away from collecting butterflies and photographing them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a generally good thing. It's like when I walk outside here now, I live in the Drool Farm, and we're supposed to be locked down, but you can here legally take a walk if you stay away from people. And when I do, I wear a mask, even though in the number of people I see and the circumstances, I don't think that the masks are much help because nobody's near me and nobody's coughing. On the other hand, I think it's a good message to send. For example, if our president wasn't an imbecile, he would wear a mask on his campaign appearances just to help make it a norm in our society.
Yeah, set a good example.
He might mess up his hair, though.
The same reason I wouldn't collect butterflies, even if they were an important population that I was studying, if it was in a national park, unless I had permission and could do it someplace where no other people would see me, because it's not even if it's legal, it's not a good message to send to be collecting anything in a national park.
So you brought up the coronavirus pandemic, and I don't really want to dwell on it too much, but it would be a crime if we didn't give you a chance to comment on that, because you're a biologist, you've got a lot of expertise in that area, you've written about it, and you know the brightest people on the planet. So what do you think is worth noting about the pandemic that we're in the middle of?
Well, I think there's two things that are worth noting. One, in the short term, and that is in the situation which we have now gotten ourselves into. I don't know a single person, virologist, epidemiologist, so on, that I know a lot of them. I trust them all. Everybody says the same thing. We desperately need a national shutdown and ordered from the top. And we desperately need somebody in charge who doesn't happen to be an imbecile, which are the ones running it now, to make sure that we get the testing kits and the protective stuff out there right now. Don't tell me it can't be done, because I remember December 7th, 1941, when our country was, up to that time, I think it built almost 4 million automobiles. And after December 7th, 1941, we quickly switched the automobile manufacturers to making tanks. And I can remember collecting milkweed pods, the food plant of the butterfly, the monarch butterfly that I worked on intensively, to get the fluff out of them to make stuffing for life preservers for the Navy. And we rationed all sorts of stuff and so on. There was real leadership. The country was mobilized. And now we're having being run by a really stupid, narcissistic, evil imbecile who is not doing any of the things that need to be done. Now, you may think of that as a political statement. It sure as hell is. We have, because the second thing is that we're facing a whole series of existential threats that you and we and many other scientists have warned about for decades and doing nothing about it. In fact, Trump is now loosening the cafe standards in order to get his businesses more profits, or the businesses of his buddies more profits, at the cost of killing many, many, many people in the future. Because if you think the health problems of this virus pandemic are serious, they're nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the health threat of climate change. There's no chance, as far as we can tell, that this particular coronavirus will kill everybody, but climate disruption can kill everybody. And we have very little time to act. And instead of acting in the right direction, this moronic imbecile is working very hard to kill Americans and other human beings in the future for his personal gain and profit.
So why do you think the coronavirus pandemic has captured attention like climate change should have and hasn't yet?
Well, I think people can relate to it more readily. After all, their parents are dying, their friends are dying. The news is covered with it. It's global. It's one of the interesting advantages of the web and the level of communication we now have, so that everybody who at least can turn on a TV or turn on a computer knows to a degree what's going on. The sad thing is, of course, the bad planning of the entire world, listening to the idiots in economics who talk about things like perpetual growth, you may have heard of that, or comparative advantage. You know, comparative advantage is why we don't have a good supply of respirators now, because to the comparative advantage thing is spread production all over the world to wherever the rich people who run the world can find the cheapest labor. So the parts are made everywhere. If you then have a thing like this that starts to break down the international movement system, all of a sudden you can't get respirators made easily. I yelled about this a long time. One of my favorite places is Costa Rica, and they gradually moved away from growing food to take care of their population to growing cash crops for China and US and so where. So if the transportation system based on fossil fuels we shouldn't be burning breaks down, the Costa Ricans may have trouble feeding themselves. The whole idea of comparative advantage has been on efficiency rather than distribution. It was put forward originally by Ricardo at a time when they thought that capital was nailed in place because capital was largely land and labor could move around. And we've now got exactly the opposite situation. You could move $1 trillion of your dollars to Arizona or Australia in a nanosecond now. I wouldn't do it. I'd hold on to your $1 trillion. But you can't move the labor that fast. So how did I get on that rant? We didn't do the planning, and we're not doing any planning now. I'm trying for the world record of rejected op-eds with my colleagues trying to point out that this is a blip, but what's coming down the road, not just in climate disruption, but also in toxification of the planet, in destruction of soils. A lot of people don't realize how much of their food comes at a distance. Many years ago, John Holder and I did a little calculation of how many Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs it would take to destroy either the United States or the Soviet Union then as functional entities. These are small bombs, 15 kilotons roughly. And we figured about 12 would do the United States and about 9 would do the Soviet Union, because all you have to do is bring down the electricity grid and hit the transportation centers like Kansas City and Chicago and so on, and most people would just starve to death, because the whole food supply is based on supply chains that are spread around the world and very, very vulnerable. There's not much food stored anywhere now. The system has to keep working, and the pandemic, of course, is likely to disrupt that system.
Paul, I'm I'm a little embarrassed to say that I just barely started reading your book.
It's ancient.
It's wonderful, and I love it so much. I'm almost done with it, and I'm kind of glad that I haven't finished it yet, just because I get to talk to you. But Dave and I have been talking for over a year about getting you on our podcast, and I've just been really, really excited. So
she has no excuse for not finishing the book by now.
I know.
You know the book that you just showed me?
Yes.
Pick it up and look, I think, in the lower left-hand corner of the front page, front cover. What does it say? There's a little diagram.
It says the population bomb keeps ticking.
Is the bomb ticking?
Yes.
No, it isn't. It's got a fuse. Nobody has ever noticed that.
Just kidding.
The population bomb fuse is still burning, but it's not ticking.
Okay.
Well, that was because they hadn't invented clocks yet when you wrote that book.
That's
God,
right.
no.
It was an hourglass. The sand is still drifting, yes.
It's a classic.
But we're obviously talking about the population bomb, and that might be one of your least favorite subjects, Paul. But let's talk about it for a minute, because your name doesn't appear in print. You're never introduced without the name of that book.
Yeah.
And I just have to ask you, after more than 50 years, are you just sick of that? Because you've written over 40 books and over 1,000 papers.
I'm only sick of it in one sense. Well, a couple things. First of all, Anne wrote it with me, but Ian Ballantine said that the book will sell better if it only has one author. And I was young and naive, but also, in a sense, right to go along with that, although I am ashamed of having done it in a certain dimension. That's one.
Why only one author?
It just turns out to be true. And you can see how they associate with, they always like a single author on a book if they can get it, and they want to build that name. It's just a marketing thing. I don't know if the publishing industry never takes data, so they may be wrong, but that's what everybody said. And the book did sell something like 3 million copies. So whatever.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that people seem to think that a scientist always believes exactly what he or she said 50 years before. And that, of course, isn't true. And there are a lot of things I would do differently and have done differently in other books since then. And the worst mistake we made was to put in scenarios, which are little stories to tell that may help you think about the future. But every reviewer treated them as if they were predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I would not do that again. But overall, the book did what Ian Ballantine and Dave Brower of the Sierra Club were the two people who asked us to do it, did what we hoped it would do. And that is, it brought the population issue into the environmental movement when it was more or less starting up big time after Rachel Carson.
I have to say, they're very clearly stated as scenarios, hypothetical scenarios, not predictions at all, because you have many of them. You're like,
you're just the fact that people review and don't read the book or lie about it. Somebody told me even a president of the United States can lie. So you can't trust everything. You got to remember, I might be a paid agent of the contraceptive industry. You can't trust me. Maybe there's no population problem at all. You got to figure things out for yourself.
But you do say you forecast that environmental change or just strong efforts towards mitigating some of the issues with, I guess, mainly pollution at the time was something that you were writing about. It's kind of unlikely that unless some economic shift were to occur, we probably won't see strong efforts towards mitigating these issues. And that's kind of where we're at today. COVID sort of has the bull by the horns, and it shifted our entire economic system in a way that's clearing our skies and kind of making room for other species to come out again. And it's kind of the silver lining. So unfortunately, it's, there's a lot more bad than good right now. But do you think, or are you hopeful that more people will use this time to just think about our relationship with the earth to try to prevent this sort of thing from happening again, rather than just accepting the inevitable that comes with no changes being made with regards to population growth?
That's why my colleagues and I are fighting for that prize of being the people to write the most and have rejected the most op-eds in a brief period of time, because we have very little time. And unless people learn the lessons from this, after all, pandemics are so tightly tied to demography that to have a pandemic and not discuss population issues is absolutely insane. But we have an absolutely insane society. The New York Times can't ever bring itself to really deal well with population because the people who own it have this as, who Noam Chomsky is?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Read what he wrote some time ago about the U.S. media and so on. There are very strict limits within which you can have debates. And one of the things you can't seriously discuss is what is desperately needed, namely a total revision of our economic system, reversing the last few hundred years of making money the basis of everything. After all, what does you hear when the idiot gets on his afternoon show and says we got to open up the country because we got to get the Dow up? It's the death or the Dow syndrome. We want to go back to super consuming. We want to go back to population growth. And this is followed by everybody. Even people as smart as Obama won't say that we have too many people, we're growing too fast. That is a major factor in our vulnerability to pandemics, and on and on. And we don't hear any discussion of, for example, the more and more crowding of human being into what's left of natural habitats and close connection with the other organisms, animals, that are sources of virtually every infectious disease humanity has ever gotten. That's where they come from. They're diseases of animals in general, and we're animals. And the more people we put in contact with them, the higher the chance is of a transfer. People don't know, for example, that measles couldn't have invaded humanity as a whole until there were cities of something like 50 to 100,000 people. I don't remember the numbers anymore. You have to have large groups for a virus to get in and can stay in unless, if the group's too small, everybody will become immune. There won't be enough susceptibles left and the virus will die out. Measles probably got into human groups many times and just died out until we had such a huge population. Say the same thing for coronavirus. The size of the population makes a wonderful mass of biomass for any virus to invade. And we've managed, by bringing our domestics to huge levels, chickens, pigs, ducks, beef, camels, all of which make us more vulnerable to pandemics. The Chinese pig, pond, duck human system has long been known as a generator of nasty viruses, and it'll keep doing it.
What do you think it'll take for people to actually have the courage to say something about it?
You want the truth?
Yeah.
Nothing. I don't think there's a chance in hell that we will get the changes we need to keep civilization going. I hate to tell you that, but I don't see any sign of it. Again, the so-called leadership doesn't want to do anything that will cut into their money. It's strictly follow the money. What is it? 0.5% of the population has, I don't remember exactly, but 50% of all of the money. That's what runs things. You know, you have a fully owned Supreme Court. There are 4 people in it who aren't fully owned, but they're going to be replaced. We have a president who is building his own money all the time. What is the chance? Maybe. I'd like to think if the Democrats took over, they could try and transform things. But I have to be honest with you, I can't be optimistic. On the other hand, I'm not going to stop fighting for it. What else is there to do?
Right.
You know, you're starting out young. I've got a plan, you see, to deal with this that you don't have.
What? Do I want to know what that is?
Sure.
It's called a funeral.
I'll be 88 in May. I'm going to die and leave it all to people like you. I had great hopes that I would die before the collapse really got going, but I missed. The smartest thing I ever did was to be born in 1932. Second smartest was marrying Anne.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Well, you should take credit for that. And I'm not asking this to argue, but are there any glimmers of hope today that you didn't see 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago?
Well, 20 years ago, we didn't see the interest in the young people, the Greta Thunberg syndrome. And I think they're going to have to go to the streets. I think they will go to the streets. They may actually, you know, Trump has had the wiseness to note that gun shops and shooting ranges are essential, along with golf courses, are essential businesses. It's going to be nasty at some point. And, you know, my daughter lives near Washington, D.C., and I think the odds of me ever seeing her again are very, very small. I don't think that in my lifetime, I'll want to fly on a commercial airliner, my lifetime being, 32 minutes or something at the moment.
Wow.
But remember, I'm a notorious pessimist.
Me too.
Let the optimists get out there.
And yet you never stop trying to help us get this right.
What else can you do?
Yeah.
You may have noticed that you're not getting the growth mania to stop after all your years of trying.
I haven't made any progress, I don't think. It's pretty sad.
You got me.
Yeah, what's your background?
I studied psychology in undergrad, so I didn't really have much of a background in environmental studies. I started getting more of an interest in it just in really starting with studying voluntary childlessness and trying to understand that and why it's important, why I think the movement is important. And it sort of just turned into this more of a personal choice that has global impacts. And then that kind of led me into finding Dave and listening to podcasts. And then I just sort of fangirled Dave and reached out to him and said, I want to be your new co-host. You need a new co-host. I don't have any experience, but can I try?
You're doing a great job. One of my favorite people is Lee Ross, who is a social psychologist who work with Kahneman and Tversky, among others. You probably don't know anything about them, but they're the people who showed how different responses were to the same question asked in different ways, which has got a huge political element in it. And I recommend to you and your listeners, there's a great book by the second author is Lee Ross. Its title is The Wisest Person in the Room, if I recall correctly. And you would find it very interesting in the work you want to do, because social psychology is a big element in why we're not getting the changes that every scientist thinks we should have in the world. Something to read when you're in your spare time when you're in graduate school with York.
Yeah.
Fascinating subject, and yet we still haven't figured out how to really cut through the roadblocks and the inertia to keep us in place, huh?
Yeah.
You know, I should have thought to look up how many of the books you've written and co-wrote with you, because I know she's co-written a lot of the books.
Yeah, most.
Most of them?
I don't know exactly. She goes off on her own track. She's been much more interested and active in working with environmental organizations and trying to keep the science straight there. She's the brains and I'm the mouth, and in a sense, I'm the book pusher. She takes the bad words out of the books
Well, I hope you can talk her into joining us on this podcast one day, because I remember that you and she both were on the panel for the West Coast premiere of the Growth Busters film, and you were a great pair after that screening.
Well, guess what? You got to lean on her, but she has voice problems and so on, and back problems.
Shoot.
Something happened to the gorgeous young woman I tracked down and married. I don't know what it was.
She's there.
But I know what caused it, because I was asking my colleague Joan Roughgarden. I was saying that, interestingly enough, now my friends are mostly getting sick and dying. And 30 years ago, they weren't. And I don't understand why. And she said, well, I think it's probably climate disruption. Explains it. That's how it's happened to Anne, too, I think.
Yeah, I should write an op-ed about that. So last book question, two-part question. So what do you think is the best book you've written, and what do you think is the most important book you've written?
Well, in terms of the best book, I would say Human Natures, because it deals with the things that most people don't want to look at, how we're dealing with things and why we do the things we do. The most important probably is the population bomb, because it had the biggest impact. Second would be, in that area, would probably be Ecoscience, which we did with John Holdren. And I know that Partha Dasgupta, the world's now best economist since our friend Ken Arrow died, he read it from cover to cover. He's probably the only economist who ever read that book from cover to cover. And he's now working very hard on things like, he's calculated that the world might be able to support 3.5 billion people at our present level. But I mean, that's his level of interest in population. So that's, I guess, where I go. The things that mean most to me are the books I wrote on checker spot butterfly biology and a paper I wrote on butterflies very recently that just interest me. I must say, the population problem is horrendous, but it doesn't interest me much because, as you can see, it's so obvious, it's so involved in everything that I don't get many eureka moments. I thought the nicest paper in that area was the one that Winus published with Winus, and I can't remember his partner's name, showing that if you had one fewer child, you saved more greenhouse gas than persuading 24 of your friends to give up driving. Mm-hmm. That was a good one. But one of the things that I find cheery is that there have been some signs that all of our efforts are working. That is, population is now more in the news and more discussed than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
We're not yet back to where it was in the late 60s, but it's out there and it's coming back. Whether it's coming back in time to do anything, who the hell knows? But we have no choice but to keep going. And if you're interesting, brilliant young women, as you clearly are with Erica, that helps get the young people on board.
Yeah.
And what can I say?
Good advice.
Great advice. Paul, I have one last question for you. What are your top 3 ways of dealing with social isolation right now?
I can tell you very simply, as long as it works. Anne and I have drinks before dinner with friends essentially every night via Zoom.
Nice.
And I talk on the phone to people. I think it's extremely important to keep we're very social animals. And it's very important to keep your social ties up. We're so vulnerable in terms of the demography in your late 80s, both of us with underlying conditions, that we don't dare do any face-to-face stuff. But if we had a sane government, you could probably arrange a country in which face-to-face stuff done carefully and with lots of testing would work again. But again, we don't show the slightest sign that there's anybody actually in the entire administration with an IQ of over 30. It's quite amazing. You got to hand it to Trump. He emptied out the executive branch of the United States. There are more empty suits there than one could possibly imagine.
Don't hold back. Tell us what you really think.
And one last question. When do you project that this whole thing will go back to what is going to be our new normal?
I'll bet he's learned his lesson on making any kind of, giving any scenarios.
Yeah, I'd like to hope that they can get themselves organized enough so that at this time next year, I will be, if I'm still alive, willing to meet friends in a restaurant under very careful conditions. As a pilot, I could get in an airplane, but I doubt if I will ever again fly in a commercial airliner. But who knows? I hope to be wrong. But let's put it this way. 50 years of predicting the problems with virus epidemics, I wasn't wrong. So what the hell?
That's right.
Well, I am so sad that our time is up.
Well, we can do it again sometime. I love what you guys are doing. Say hello to York for me. He may remember me.
I sure will. I'll be sure to share this episode with him.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Paul.
It's been my great pleasure. Take care. Have a wonderful career. I hope I see you again before you finish your PhD.
Same here.
Okay.
Stay healthy and say hello to Anne from us.
Yeah, give our best to Anne.
I will.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Well, Erica, I'm pretty sure that conversation with Paul Ehrlich will go down as a real highlight of your career, at least so far.
Yeah. I really enjoyed listening to Paul's personal story and how there was really no outside pressure to censor himself. He was asking the important questions at the time, and I'm glad that he was rewarded for it. I'm so glad that Stanford gave him a place to speak his mind freely and openly.
You know, it turns out that his outspokenness is what got him invited back time and time again to The Tonight Show, because Johnny Carson was really afraid to bring a scientist onto the show. He was afraid that if he had a scientist on The Tonight Show, that it would be a dreadful bore. And as you know, there's nothing dreadfully boring about Paul Ehrlich, the guy.
Not at all.
He's very entertaining. And so that's made him a great guest on The Tonight Show some 20 times, and it's made him a pretty in-demand speaker at college campuses and all kinds of public events for 50 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're going to find this interesting, Erica. You know, the book had been out over a year, and it hadn't gotten very many reviews. It hadn't really gotten the attention that the Sierra Club and Paul and Ann Ehrlich and Ballantine Books had hoped it would get. And it wasn't until Paul shared with us that Johnny Carson read the book and then wanted to have him on the show. Well, once he was on The Tonight Show, the book took off. That was when the book took off. And that was just a few months before that first Earth Day. Oh, and this is another interesting thing. Just before the first Earth Day, Paul Ehrlich was invited back for his second appearance on The Tonight Show, and he stayed on the couch and talked to Johnny Carson on the air for over an hour.
Neat.
Nobody gets an hour on the couch. The show's not 90 minutes anymore. Now it's 60 minutes, but that's just unheard of. All right.
I think that the conversation is a great example of just how articulate and entertaining Paul is. I think he probably had a lot of the same views of the current Trump administration as he did back then, and recently was probably just as frustrated as he was back then and felt the same about the makeup of the cabinet and other administration members. So yeah, we didn't talk to him since Trump was reelected. We didn't have a chance to interview Paul again, but would have been entertaining to hear his thoughts on the current state of affairs.
Yeah, this one was obviously during Trump won. You're right. You mentioned he was entertaining, and he even wrote a paper that was published in a demography journal encouraging scientists to be more outspoken. He felt scientists had a duty to try to communicate with the public and to stand up for what they think is right and not to shrink from controversy, not to shrink from the limelight, not to try too hard to be boring, I guess you could say. And not everybody agrees with that. But the fact that he wasn't boring, I think, has led to some of the critiques that we're reading and hearing in the wake of his passing. Now, there's a guy, Josh Spodek. He's been on the Growth Busters podcast at least once, probably a couple of times. He's really brilliant, a good sustainability leader, and he wrote a thoughtful but I think pretty critical piece following Ehrlich's passing titled, "Did Paul Ehrlich Help or Hurt His Cause?" I'm just going to share just a couple of words from that. I'm quoting Joshua Spodek here. He called people who disagreed with him idiots, or something like people who can't count to 20 without taking their shoes off. He wasn't perfect. Nobody is. But though he acknowledged he was wrong on some points, he didn't take responsibility for mistakes. He just said that he would be right in the long run. And went on later to say, did he make any difference? Is it possible his work net harmed his goals? And can anyone show that his work affected human population levels in any way? It looks like what community he built was temporary, while his fueling of those who opposed him enduring. Joshua didn't think Paul's approach of being pretty outspoken about people he didn't agree with, Josh had a problem with that. He didn't think that that was going to be effective at changing the world. May be true, but Paul's approach got him on The Tonight Show more than 20 times. Paul's approach got him invited to speak at numerous events around the world. It got him attention. It got him in the news. It managed to make human overpopulation a news item back in the late 60s and early 70s. It brought a lot of attention to the issue. Did it change the minds of those who were in denial? Maybe not. But you know what? Many other approaches have been tried over the years, and I don't see any evidence that they changed any minds either.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on a kind of everything you just stated. That I personally find it very impressive that a scientist who largely talks about facts and data, you know, something that could be very dry, was so entertaining that he was invited on one of the most popular shows more than 20 times. He was the author of a best-selling book, a nonfiction book that sold more than 3 million copies. I mean, just those things in their own rights to me is some level of success, because someone else that wasn't so sort of incendiary probably wouldn't have gotten that level of attention. And where would we be then? So I'm not sure that this critique is, I think it's a great question to ask, but instead of focusing on one specific person and his approach, I think it's more a symptom of our broader global situation and economy and human psychology, probably, that we haven't really changed course as much as we should have. And I'm not sure that any one person could have done that. You know, I think a lot of people have actually tried to work on this topic and make it more broadly known and help change the course of humanity. And no one has really been that successful, right? So why do we want to demonize this one man to this degree?
Well, and in Joshua's defense, he tried really hard to couch this not as a critique, but what could we learn from Paul Ehrlich's life? But I'm going to say, yeah, but it's a critique too. You know, here we are recording this episode in March, and I'm in Colorado at a little over 6,000 feet, and we've had several days here above 80 degrees in March. I've never seen 80 degrees in March in Colorado, ever. Is that changing anybody's minds about the fact that they feel like there isn't a climate emergency? Not seeing much behavior change so far from actual lived experience here. So people do wring their hands, including us, trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we educate people, but also how do we inspire changes in lifestyle, changes in public policy, et cetera. It's challenging. And I found myself thinking, Stephanie, about other people who have been somewhat insulting or abrasive, more entertaining on various important social subjects. George Carlin. Should George Carlin have been a nicer guy? Should Michael Moore not have made the films he made? Should John Oliver not be hosting Last Week Tonight? Should Jon Stewart, Desi Lydic, and the rest of those talented people at The Daily Show stop making The Daily Show? I think there's a role for everyone in this. And certainly, I think I need to look in the mirror, right, Stephanie? Sure, I'm going to defend those people because I'm not trying hard to be polite and boring. It's not my style. I happen to think Michael Moore is a pretty good documentary filmmaker. He got people to pay money and go to the movie theater to watch documentaries. And he didn't do it by being gentle and not calling an idiot an idiot. So some of these people inspire people to action, hopefully. Some bring attention to the issue. Few of them actually change people's minds, I'm afraid. I wish we could, but we need a sledgehammer or something for that.
Yeah, and I guess fundamentally, and as you introed Josh Spodek, I really admire Josh. I've spoken about him on the podcast before, and I've really enjoyed reading his ideas about sustainability. And I think Josh's methods are really valuable. But fundamentally, his question in his essay was, did he make any difference? And is it possible his work net harmed his goals? I think my take on it is, yes, he absolutely made a difference. And I don't think that his work net harmed his goals. That's my take on it. I think that he was just truly authentically himself, and he based everything he did and said on data and logic to back it up. And I think that there's plenty of people out there that don't do the same. And so I think that's kind of the best that you can be in this world. And really, everyone else's reaction to him speaks more to those people than to Paul himself, if they're not willing to pay attention to that data and look at their own behaviors and take those cautionary statements and be more introspective and think about how they want to leave the planet for their children. That's on them. It's not necessarily on Paul. So I think I kind of come down on wanting to defend Paul in this situation, even though I very much respect Josh.
Well, there are a lot of scientists out there who are really pretty cautious about what they say and what they write for fear that they will lose their funding, not get published, lose their research jobs or teaching jobs. They feel like they have to be extra diplomatic in order to keep doing the work. And they feel like that's a trade-off maybe they wish they didn't have to make, but they're willing to make that trade. I don't think Paul ever made that trade-off. And I always thought it was amazing, astonishing, really, that he kept his job at Stanford University all these years, in spite of the fact that he told it like it was. And you got to wonder, wow, what would happen if hundreds or thousands of scientists actually spoke with that a level of candor? Maybe that would change the world.
Yeah.
Interesting. There's been a conversation about this at the Growthbusters online community. If you're interested in exploring our online community, you can go to groups.io/Growthbusters and consider joining it if you want. It doesn't cost anything to join. There's been a thread of emails back and forth about what Josh has written. And I wanted to share something that Jan Mulder wrote. He actually hosts his own podcast, which is My Sustainable Life for an Earth in Balance, in the Netherlands. And it's in the Dutch language, so you can't really listen to it unless you are willing to put up with some kind of translation in the process or know the language. But anyway, he wrote something interesting. He wrote, being aware doesn't solve anything, but not being aware doesn't start anything.
Very true.
If that's all Paul Ehrlich did, that was an accomplishment. And then one last thing that Josh wrote about Paul, he actually said that Paul admitted being wrong a few times, but in the big picture, Josh and many other critics wanted Paul to somehow make a bigger admission that, well, if I was wrong about the date that some disaster was going to happen, then I'm wrong about the underlying concept or something like that. And I think that throws them all off and it bugs them because Paul wasn't willing to undermine the basic concept that there are limits to growth, that we have a finite planet, we've outgrown that planet, and we're busy sawing off the limb of the tree that we're sitting on. That is true no matter what errors Paul made in some of his predictions. Paul admitted that he was off on those predictions, but he wouldn't admit that he was wrong about limits to growth because he wasn't.
Yeah, he's gotten a tough rap in many circles.
You know, unfortunately, cornucopians and techno-optimists are always looking for things that will support their denial of limits to growth. So they cling to Ehrlich's relatively minor errors as proof that we're finding ways around those limits. And Paul tried really hard to not let them make those end runs. I wanted to share, as we get close to wrapping up, an interesting example of this denial and the end runs that techno-optimists try to make around the fundamental correct facts that there are limits to growth and that we are currently damaging our critical life-supporting ecosystems. And I found this example in a short 2015 documentary called Population Bomb: The Dire Prediction That Fell Flat. And this was produced by Retro Report, and it had some pretty respectable funding. I find it just astonishing, because it comes off to me as a conspiracy theory report, but it was put together by serious reporters and producers who really thought that they were doing real journalism. And at the end of that documentary, we hear this from Stuart Brand.
While certain population hotspots remain a concern, largely in areas with the scarcest resources, much of the world is now grappling with the flip side of the population bomb.
The point at which population peaks, around 9 billion in the 2040s or 50s, the story will not be, oh my God, we got 9 billion people, how horrible. It'll be, oh my God, we're running out of people.
Now that was from Stuart Brand, who actually was a student of Paul Ehrlich's at Stanford. And back in the day was a pretty famous environmentalist. But he has really changed his tune over the last 40 or 50 years to the point where he provided that soundbite in an interview for that little mini documentary.
Yeah, and that was about 10 years ago, I guess. And he's not wrong, because now everyone is concerned that we're running out of people, but they're worried for the wrong reasons. They're worried that the economy isn't going to function the way that it's always functioned, which completely ignores all of the other things that we need to really be worried about, of course. So pick your poison.
Yeah. This whole idea that we're running out of people and that's a big problem is a real dangerous notion. It's one of the most important things that we've got to snuff out. And that's why it's so important that we share the wit and wisdom of Paul Ehrlich and the wit and wisdom of Stephanie Gardner and Dave Gardner, too.
Exactly.
The truth is, ever since the 1968 predictions of the Ehrlichs, we've been building a house of cards to keep delivering food, shelter, and transportation for this growing mass of humans on the planet. Humans and our livestock now comprise 96% of the mammalian biomass on the planet. We're engaged in the destruction of ecosystems and disruption of our climate to the point that it probably will soon be unfit for human occupation. So this is serious business, and what Paul Ehrlich was trying to communicate with everyone, every chance he got, was that this cannot go on. It's not going to have a happy ending if we don't change our ways.
Yeah, and I think that prediction, that broader prediction, is completely true. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this podcast with you, Dad.
You would be embarrassed to be my daughter.
I am embarrassed when you say some of your bad dad jokes in public, but I'm not embarrassed about everything that we talk about on the Growth Busters podcast. That's for sure.
Now, subsequent to that episode 43, we did have Paul again on the podcast on episode 70, Paul Ehrlich on the limits to growth in June of 2022, because that was the 50th anniversary of publication of the limits to growth. So we did an episode about the limits to growth. And as I mentioned up top, we're not planning to reprise that here, but you can easily find it, and we'll put a link in the show notes. But I mention it here now just because I want to share two quick sound bites from that interview that I just think are Quintessential Paul.
Earth Day at one time was something besides bullshit. Now it's all bullshit, because the main thing is, as you may have noticed, I think, that the basic crucial issues, that is growth of population, growth of consumption, inequity, they're the basic drivers. And you can, on Earth Day, listen all day. If you got the guts to Fox News, you'll never hear a word about them. If you have an Earth Day without any mention of the demographic situation and overconsumption, forget it.
You, Stephanie, and I were co-hosting at the time. I want to just share what he said as we were wrapping up the conversation.
Well, my great pleasure, as always. I don't know why you keep fighting the hopeless fight, but then I don't know why I do either. Turn the world over to your daughter, for God's sake.
Yeah, he was a riot. Paul, thank you again for your legacy, and I hope you're enjoying many glasses of wine in your afterlife. You deserve it.
Yes, and chasing good women. He had such a great sense of humor. He will be missed.
He will be missed for sure.
Don't forget, we've got the Growthbusters Earth Day Film Festival coming up. Head over to earthdayfilmfestival.com on April 16th or anytime after that and begin your planetary stewardship binge. If you want to make a difference, please share this episode of the podcast with people you love or anyone who needs to learn about limits to growth. That could be your mayor, your governor, senator, prime minister, president, journalists, anybody.
Click donate at the top of the homepage at growthbusters.org.
Jump onto our email list at the same place.
And you can also check out the Growthbusters online community at groups.io.
And I want to thank Jake Fader for writing and producing the Growthbusters theme song that you hear at the open and close of this podcast, and also in the Growthbusters documentary that you'll see on the Growthbusters Earth Day Film Festival. Don't forget about that. And I also want to thank Carlos Jones for singing that song.
Thanks again for listening, sharing, and doing your part. We've got a planet to save.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.